Betrayed and publicly humiliated by her husband, she disappears without a trace. Years later, she returns a multimillionaire and executes a revenge so devastating that he falls to his knees begging for forgiveness. His bitter regret reveals a secret that changes everything. Before you watch, like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are from so we can deliver even more videos to you. The Magnolia Hotel glittered like a jewel in the starry night, its golden lights reflecting on the polished windows and the gleaming marble of the lobby. To any observer, it was just another high society party, crystal glasses clinking, polite laughter echoing through the ornate halls, expensive perfumes mixing in the air. But for Teresa, that night would mark the beginning of a journey that would transform her soul forever. Standing before the large mirror in the ladies' restroom, Teresa nervously adjusted her navy blue dress. It was not a designer piece like the ones adorning the other guests, but it had been chosen with care, saving for months to look adequate beside her important husband. The pearls she wore around her neck were real, a gift for their 5th wedding anniversary, a time when Albert still seemed proud to have her as his wife. "Can you do this?" she whispered to herself, rehearsing a smile that did not reach her brown eyes. "It's just another party, but you already know when something is deeply wrong, don't you? That unsettling feeling that settles at the bottom of your stomach like a weight that cannot be ignored." Teresa had been feeling this for months, in the secret phone calls Albert received and would step away to answer, in the feminine perfume, different from hers, that sometimes lingered on his shirts on nights when he arrived home too late, with increasingly unconvincing excuses. Returning to the main hall, her eyes instinctively searched for Albert. He was near the stage, talking animatedly with his partner, Ronald. The two men formed a successful duo in the civil construction business. Albert, with his natural charm that won over clients. Ronald, with his calculating mind for business. Beside them, laughing at something Ronald said, was Monica, the new executive secretary of the company, stunning in her red dress, which left little to the imagination. Have you ever felt that moment when the world seems to slow down? When every detail becomes painfully clear, as if your senses were amplified to capture the impending catastrophe? That's how Teresa saw the look that Albert cast at Monica. It was not the look of a boss at his employee. It was the same look that years ago he had directed at her. "Is everything okay, dear?" The voice of one of the executive's wives brought her back to reality. "You look a little pale." "I'm fine," Teresa replied automatically, the social smile returning to her face like a well-rehearsed mask. "Just a little tired." The music dimmed, and the master of ceremonies announced that it was time for the host's speech. The lights focused on the small stage set up in the center of the hall. Albert walked confidently to the microphone, but not alone. Monica was by his side, their hands intertwined like lovers who no longer need to hide their affection. The silence that took over the hall was deafening. Dozens of eyes turned simultaneously to Teresa, some with thinly veiled pity, others with the morbid excitement of those watching a car accident in slow motion. "Good evening, everyone," Albert began, his amplified voice echoing through the hall. "Tonight is special for many reasons. Our company has reached record numbers this year, and we are about to start the biggest project in our history." Polite applause filled the room. Teresa remained motionless, her body frozen, while her mind screamed for her to run away. "But there is another reason to celebrate today," he continued, squeezing Monica's hand. "As some of you may have already realized, my personal life is undergoing significant transformations. Can you imagine the sound of someone's heart breaking? It's not like in movies or books. There's no dramatic crack or explosion of emotion. It's a deep silence, an emptiness that expands until it consumes everything around it. After much reflection, I realized that my marriage to Teresa has come to an end. She is a wonderful woman." He looked briefly in her direction, with what seemed to be a mix of pity and impatience. But she never truly understood my dreams, my ambitions. And in Monica, he smiled at the young woman beside him, I found not only an exceptional business partner, but the true love of my life. The murmur that followed was like waves crashing against rocks, growing, uncontrollable, deafening. Teresa felt the ground sway under her feet. The betrayal itself was not a surprise. Deep down, she already knew. But the public humiliation, the spectacle of her marital failure transformed into entertainment for the city's elite. She could never have imagined that. Ms. Clelia, her mother-in-law, watched the scene from a distance with a discreet smile of satisfaction. The family matriarch had never hidden her displeasure with her son's choice. Teresa was too simple, without the social pedigree or sophistication that the family expected. Now, her look clearly said, I always knew this would happen. In the midst of the chaos of emotions, Teresa felt a gentle hand on her arm. It was Teresa, for years her housekeeper, and in moments like this, her only true ally in that world of appearances. Let's get out of here, Mrs. Teresa, whispered the older woman, her face marked by wrinkles of genuine concern. But Teresa couldn't move. Her eyes were fixed on Albert and Monica, who were now receiving congratulations as if they were announcing an engagement and not the destruction of a 7-year marriage. It was Ronald who broke the trance, approaching with a glass of champagne as if nothing had happened. Teresa, dear, he said with false cordiality, these things happen in the best of families. I'm sure you can resolve this civilly. The hypocrisy in his voice was what finally brought Teresa back to reality. She looked at Ronald, seeing for the first time the malice disguised behind the friendly smile. He had always been there, feeding Albert's ambitions, pushing him away from her with promises of grandeur and power. Thank you for your concern, Ronald, she replied, her voice surprisingly firm. But I think you've already done enough for our family. Without waiting for a response, Teresa turned and walked towards the exit. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, curious glances following her every step. Some pretended not to see, continuing their conversations in a low voice. Others watched openly, feeding on the drama that broke the monotony of their privileged lives. The rain began to fall when Teresa left the hotel, heavy drops that mixed with the tears she finally allowed herself to shed. Without a car, they had arrived together in Albert's, and not wanting to call a taxi where everyone could see her, she simply started walking. The wet streets reflected the city lights like broken mirrors, fragments of a distorted reality. The blue dress, chosen with so much care, was now soaked, clinging to her body like a second skin. Her hair, once meticulously styled, fell in heavy strands around her face. Have you ever felt that sense of unreality that accompanies moments of crisis? As if you were watching a movie about your own life, unable to believe that this is really happening to you. When Teresa finally got home, it was still her home, at least for that night. She found her suitcases already packed by the front door. The message could not be clearer. Her presence was no longer welcome. Her expulsion had been planned long before that night's spectacle. Ms. Clelia was in the living room, her face a mask of false concern. "Ah, you're here," she said, as if Teresa were an unwanted visitor and not the daughter-in-law who had lived there for years. "I thought it was better to get things moving, you understand, don't you? It's better for everyone that this is resolved quickly and without scandals." Behind her, 2 men in suits waited, security guards hired to ensure the transition went smoothly. "Where are my things?" Teresa asked. Her voice just a whisper. "Everything that's yours is in the suitcases," her mother-in-law replied with a dismissive gesture. "The furniture, the jewelry, all that belongs to the family, naturally. The jewelry was gifts given by my son with family money," Ms. Clelia cut in. "Frankly, Teresa, you didn't really expect to take any of that. Be reasonable." In that moment, something changed inside Teresa. The pain was still there, overwhelming and brutal. But next to it, something new was born. A spark of anger, a seed of determination. "Where is Teresa?" she asked, looking for the only person who could offer her some comfort at that moment. Dismissed for today, we thought it was better that way. With trembling hands, Teresa took only one of the suitcases, the smallest one, ironically, knowing instinctively that it would contain her most personal belongings. The rest, as Ms. Clelia had made clear, no longer belonged to her. Before leaving, however, she did something that surprised even herself. She approached her mother-in-law, who instinctively recoiled as if she feared being assaulted. "One day," Teresa said, her voice low but clear, "you will remember this night, and you will regret it." It was not a threat. It was a promise. The rain continued to fall when Teresa left the mansion that had been her home. With only one suitcase and the money she kept hidden in a personal account, a habit that Albert had always ridiculed as poor people's paranoia, she disappeared into the night. What no one knew, not even Albert or his merciless mother, was that that night did not mark the end of Teresa's story. It was just the first chapter, because even on the darkest nights, when the rain seems endless and every step is an exercise in sheer willpower, there is a truth that sustains those who have been deeply wounded. Sometimes, we need to lose everything to discover who we really are. And Teresa was about to discover a strength within herself that she never imagined she possessed. The dawn of a new beginning. Dawn arrived with a peculiar cruelty. Have you ever noticed how the sunlight can seem like an offense when your world collapsed the night before? For Teresa, the first rays that filtered through the fogged window of the interstate bus were like sharp knives, reminding her that, despite everything, the world kept turning with indifference to her suffering. Sitting in the back seat, with the only suitcase she had managed to save on the seat beside her, Teresa watched the landscape slowly transform. The city's skyscrapers gave way to open fields, which eventually gave way to the sight of the sea, vast, relentless, and somehow comforting in its constancy. She did not have a planned destination, just a ticket to the farthest point her money would allow. A small coastal town, one of those that are forgotten on tourist maps, inhabited mainly by fishermen and retirees seeking peace away from urban centers. "Next stop, Shell Harbor," the driver announced, his monotonous voice echoing through the almost empty bus. Teresa straightened up in her seat, her muscles protesting after hours of immobility. She had not slept. How could she? The images of the previous night repeated themselves like a horror movie in her mind. Monica's triumphant smile, Ms. Clelia's poorly disguised satisfaction, Albert's calculated indifference, and the looks, those looks of pity, amusement, and morbid curiosity that followed her to the hotel exit. The bus stopped with a jolt in front of a simple station, little more than a tiled roof over a worn wooden bench. Teresa got off, immediately greeted by the unmistakable smell of sea air and the distant sound of waves breaking on the beach. "First time here?" asked a man with skin tanned by the sun, who seemed to be the only other living soul in that forgotten station. Teresa nodded, unsure of how much she should reveal. "You'll like the place," he continued, pointing to a street that went down towards the sea. "If you're looking for a place to stay, Mrs. Zephyr rents rooms in that blue house down there. It's not luxury, but it's clean and honest." With a murmured thank you, Teresa followed the indicated direction. Her shoes, unsuitable for the uneven cobblestone streets, made her stumble occasionally. Yesterday, she was the wife of one of the most prominent businessmen in the big city. Today, she was just another anonymous outsider, carrying a suitcase and secrets too heavy for her delicate shoulders. The blue house was not difficult to find. It stood out among the simple buildings on the street, not for its grandeur, but for the evident care in every detail. Colorful flowers adorned the small front garden, and the white wooden windows were all open, inviting the sea breeze inside. Mrs. Zifa was in the garden when Teresa approached. She was a short lady, with white hair tied in a loose bun, and hands that showed decades of hard work. She looked at the newcomer with the natural curiosity of someone who lives in small towns, but without the invasiveness common to gossips. "Good morning," Teresa greeted, her voice still weak after hours of not being used. "I heard you rent rooms." Mrs. Zepha's eyes, a surprisingly vivid blue for someone her age, studied Teresa for a moment. She saw the small suitcase, the clothes too fine for that place, the puffy eyes of someone who had cried all night, and the barely disguised desperation of someone with nowhere to go. "I have a room in the back," she replied, wiping her hands on her floral apron. "It's not much, but it has a view of the sea. I think it will do while you rest." The word rest hung in the air like an offer of truce. She did not ask why a woman clearly accustomed to comforts arrived alone, with only one suitcase, in a city where she probably knew no one. She did not ask how long she planned to stay. She just made space in her house and, in a way, in her life. The room was, as promised, simple but welcoming. A single bed with a firm mattress, a dark wooden dresser that must have witnessed decades of stories, and a window that framed the ocean like a living painting. "The bathroom is shared at the end of the hall," Mrs. Zifa explained. "Breakfast is served at 7, but if you need to leave early or sleep in late, just let me know." She paused, as if considering her next words. "Here we respect each other's space. Your stories are yours to tell, when and if you want." With that, she left Teresa alone with her thoughts and the vastness of the sea as the only witness to her silent tears. The first few days passed in a fog of pain and exhaustion. Teresa slept a lot, her body and mind seeking refuge in the temporary forgetfulness that only sleep could offer. When she was awake, she spent hours sitting on the small balcony, watching the hypnotic movement of the waves. It was during one of these contemplative afternoons that Mrs. Zepha joined her, bringing a tray with herbal tea and homemade biscuits. "When my August died," the old lady began without preamble, while pouring the tea into delicate cups, "I thought the world had ended. 42 years together, just imagine. One day he went out fishing and never came back." Teresa looked at her, surprised by both the story and the realization that this was the first time she had really paid attention to her hostess. How did you move on?" Her voice was hoarse from disuse. Mrs. Zepha smiled, a smile that carried both joy and melancholy. "I didn't. Not right away. First, I had to learn to stand still, to feel all the pain without running from it. It's like a big wave, you know? If you try to fight it, it drags you under. But if you dive into it, you eventually come out on the other side." The words hit Teresa with unexpected force. Since the night of the humiliation, she had been in constant motion, physical or mental, as if she could leave the pain behind if she just ran fast enough. "And then?" she asked, finally accepting the offered cup. "Then?" Mrs. Zepha continued, her hands never stopping the work even as they talked. "I discovered that my hands still knew how to create even when my heart was broken, and that was enough salvation. That afternoon, something changed imperceptibly in the air between the two women. It was not yet friendship. Teresa's wound was too raw to allow any real intimacy, but it was a beginning, an opening, a small crack through which light could eventually enter. The phoenix rises. Have you ever had that moment when you realize you survived what you swore would destroy you? That instant of clarity when, amidst the pain that still lingers, you recognize that you are still breathing, still here, still able to feel something other than suffering. For Teresa, that moment came during the 3rd week in Shell Harbor. She woke up before dawn, restless after a dream she couldn't fully remember. Instead of forcing herself back to sleep, she got up and walked to the beach, still deserted at that hour. The sea was calm, almost placid, reflecting the first pink tones of the sky. Teresa took a deep breath, letting the salty air fill her lungs, and then, without warning, felt an overwhelming urge to go into the water. She didn't stop to think. If she had, maybe reason would have stopped her. She simply walked forward, letting the gentle waves wet her feet first, then her ankles, knees, waist. She kept walking until the water reached her neck, and only then did she stop. She floated there, suspended between sky and sea, feeling the salt on her skin like a baptism. The tears came, but this time, they were different. They were not just of pain, but also of relief, of acceptance, of understanding that no matter how deep the wound, time keeps moving, and with it comes the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility of healing. When she finally returned to the beach, the sun had already fully risen. Teresa sat on the sand, her hair dripping, her soaked clothes clinging to her body, and did something she hadn't done since the night of the party. She smiled, a small, hesitant, but genuine smile. It was with this new energy, still fragile, but undeniably present, that Teresa finally asked Mrs. Zephyr about the work she always saw in her hands. "This is bobbin lace," the old lady replied, showing the delicate pattern that emerged from the dance of the small wooden pieces between her experienced fingers. "I learned it from my grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother. It's getting lost, you know? Girls today don't have the patience for this kind of thing." "Could you teach me?" Teresa asked, surprising herself as much as her hostess. Mrs. Zephyr studied her for a moment, as if assessing whether the request was genuine or just courtesy. "Your hands are too delicate," she commented finally. "They'll get calluses." "Good," Teresa replied, looking at her pale palms that had never known physical labor. Maybe it's time for them to learn something new. And so began a new phase. In the mornings, Teresa helped Mrs. Zephyr with the boarding house chores, cleaning rooms, doing laundry, learning to cook simple but flavorful dishes. In the afternoons, they sat on the balcony, and Teresa received her first lessons in the art of lace. At first, her fingers were clumsy, unable to reproduce the fluid and precise movements of her mentor. The threads would get tangled, the patterns would come out crooked, and she would often end the day with small cuts and sore blisters on her once well-kept hands. "Patience," Mrs. Zephyr would advise whenever Teresa sighed in frustration. "You don't learn in a day what it took me decades to master." While Teresa slowly built a new routine by the sea, life continued in the big city she had left behind. Albert and Monica had made their relationship official with a discreet but elegant ceremony, the kind of event that would be on the cover of local society magazines. "The perfect couple," the photo captions read, showing the two smiling in their impeccable outfits. No one mentioned the abandoned ex-wife, as if Teresa had been not only expelled from the house and family, but also erased from the very narrative of their lives. Teresa, however, had not forgotten. The maid who had faithfully served the family for years kept secret contact with Teresa through sporadic calls from a public phone to the only cell phone at Mrs. Zephyr's boarding house. "Mrs. Teresa," she said in one of these conversations, her voice low, even though no one could hear her. "Things are changing here. That Ronald, you know, is always whispering in your husband's ears, Mr. Albert's." "What kind of things?" Teresa asked, feeling a curiosity that surprised her. She thought she had left behind any interest in that life. "Strange business. Contracts that don't seem right. I heard him say the other day, 'Now that you've gotten rid of that meddling woman, we can do things my way.' As if you were an obstacle to his plans. Something in that information lit a spark in Teresa. It was not just the natural resentment for how she had been treated, but a deeper understanding that perhaps her presence in Albert's life had been more significant than he, or she herself, had ever realized. "Keep telling me everything, Teresa," she requested, before hanging up. It might be important. As the weeks turned into months, Teresa's hands gained strength and skill. The calluses, once painful, were now marks of silent pride. The lace she produced still didn't have the perfection of Mrs. Zepha's creations, but there was something different about it. An unexpected fusion between traditional technique and a modern sensibility that Teresa herself didn't know she possessed. "You have an eye for this," Mrs. Zepha commented one afternoon, observing a particularly intricate pattern that Teresa had developed. "You're not just copying, you're creating." It was during these long afternoons of manual work that Teresa began to rediscover parts of herself that had been silenced during the years of marriage. She remembered how she had always liked to draw, how she had dreamed of studying design before she met Albert and became absorbed in the role of the perfect wife. On nights when sleep refused to come, Teresa would take the fabric scraps that Mrs. Zepha would give her, mix different techniques, incorporate unusual materials, creating pieces that were not just traditional lace, but works that told stories, her stories. The first time someone was interested in buying one of her creations was almost by accident. A tourist staying at the boarding house saw a shawl that Teresa had made and insisted on taking it, offering an amount that left the novice artisan speechless. "That's more than I earn in a month helping Mrs. Zepha," she confided to her mentor after the tourist left. "It's a fair price," the old lady replied with simplicity. "What you do is art, girl, and art has its price." That first payment was like a confirmation, a sign that perhaps there was a way forward, not just a flight from the past, but a direction for the future. On a particularly warm afternoon, while they worked under the shade of the trees in the garden, Mrs. Zepha made a suggestion that would change everything. "Next weekend there's a craft fair in the central square. Why don't you take some of your pieces to sell?" Teresa hesitated. Until then, her new life had been contained within the safe limits of the boarding house, with the exception of occasional walks on the beach. The idea of exposing herself and her work to the outside world was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. "What if no one likes it? What if no one buys?" she asked, giving voice to the fears that haunted her. Mrs. Zepha laughed, a comforting sound, like the tinkling of bells in the wind. "What if they buy everything? What if your pieces are the most admired at the fair? You see, we can imagine 1,000 scenarios, but we'll only know the truth if we try." That's how, 6 months after her desperate escape, Teresa found herself setting up a small stall at the local fair. Her creations, shawls, scarves, details for clothes and accessories, were carefully arranged, each piece telling part of her emotional journey, although potential customers could not have known that. The response was beyond her most optimistic expectations. Not only did she sell almost everything she had brought, but she received enthusiastic praise and even orders for future pieces. Among the visitors was a woman who stood out for her discreet elegance and discerning eye. Yvonne, the owner of a boutique in a larger city nearby. "Your work is extraordinary," she said, carefully examining a lace scarf with golden threads. "I've never seen anything like it. It's traditional but also contemporary. Familiar, but surprising." Teresa thanked her, still uncomfortable with the compliments. Part of her was still that insecure woman who needed her husband's and mother-in-law's constant approval. "I have a proposal for you," Yvonne continued. "I would like to sell your pieces in my store. The commission would be fair, and I have clientele who would appreciate and pay well for this type of quality handmade work." The offer was tempting, but Teresa felt an inexplicable tightness in her chest. Selling her creations meant exposing herself to the world again. What if someone from her old life recognized her? What if the news reached Albert, Ms. Clelia? As if reading her thoughts, Yvonne added, "We don't need to use your real name if you prefer. Many artists work with pseudonyms." That night, back at the boarding house, Teresa shared the proposal with Mrs. Zepha. seeking advice from the wisdom of the older woman. "Fear is natural," the old lady said, her hands never stopping their work, even as they talked. "But don't let it define your limits. You ran away to survive. Now you need to decide if you just want to survive or if you want to live fully." The words echoed in Teresa's mind as she watched the sea through her bedroom window. The same sea that had witnessed her despair now reflected the full moon, a silver path over the dark waters, like a promise, an invitation to move forward. The next morning, Teresa called Yvonne and accepted the proposal. Not as Teresa, the humiliated and rejected ex-wife, but as Aurora, a name that carried with it the promise of a new dawn. Meanwhile, miles away, in his luxurious office, Albert looked worriedly at the numbers in front of him. The risky decisions Ronald had convinced him to make were beginning to show their first signs of trouble. Nothing serious yet, nothing that couldn't be overcome, but an unsettling omen of what was to come. "Maybe we should reconsider the Northern Region project," he suggested to his partner, who was distractedly flipping through a luxury car magazine. "Nonsense," Ronald replied with a confident smile. "Great rewards require great risks. You're getting soft, Albert. Is Monica's pregnancy making you too cautious?" The mention of the pregnancy, still in its early stages but already a reason for celebration among colleagues, made Albert smile automatically. A child, finally. Something Teresa had never been able to handle during all those years. Teresa. The name still caused an uncomfortable pang in his chest. Sometimes, in moments of sincerity with himself, he wondered where she was, how she was. But those moments were rare and quickly suppressed by the busy routine and Ronald's constant reminders of how he was better off without her. "Trust me," Ronald said, placing a heavy hand on his partner's shoulder. "By the end of the year, we'll be the biggest in the country, and it's all because you had the courage to make the right choices." Albert nodded, pushing away the momentary doubts. After all, Ronald had always been right so far, hadn't he? It was he who had suggested the expansion that had doubled profits the previous year. It was he who had introduced the investors, who allowed the opening of the branch in the capital. And it was he who, on that fateful night, had whispered in his ear, "She's holding you back, my friend. She's always been more loyal to her conscience than to you. If you want to really grow, you need to get rid of that weight." What Albert did not realize, as he signed another potentially disastrous contract, was that he was slowly losing control not only of his company, but of his own life. And while the empire he had built was imperceptibly beginning to crumble, the woman he had discarded as irrelevant was taking the first steps to build something entirely new. Not from the destruction caused by others, but from the strength she had discovered within herself. The final act. Time has a curious way of turning wounds into scars. Scars don't disappear. They remain with us, indelible marks of past battles. But unlike open wounds, they no longer bleed to the touch. That's how it was with Teresa, now known as Aurora, in the small but growing circle of admirers of her handcrafted work. A year had passed since that first fair, where Yvonne had discovered her talent. A year of hard work, of nights spent by candlelight perfecting techniques, creating original patterns, transforming tradition into innovation. A year in which her delicate hands, once adorned only with expensive rings, developed calluses that she displayed with silent pride. "We need to talk," Yvonne announced one autumn afternoon, appearing unexpectedly at Mrs. Zepha's boarding house. Her eyes shone with that characteristic intensity that always appeared when she had a new idea. Sitting on the balcony facing the sea, the two women shared a tea while the sea breeze gently rustled the palm leaves. "Your pieces are selling faster than I can restock," Yvonne continued, her enthusiasm almost palpable. "Last week, a client from Sao Paulo came especially to buy one of your shawls. Another one ordered 10 pieces to give as gifts at an international event." Teresa smiled. still not completely comfortable with the success. It was strange to think that her creations, born of pain and the need for rebuilding, were now objects of desire. What I'm trying to say, Yvonne placed her cup on the table with determination, is that we're no longer talking about local crafts. We're talking about a potential brand, something unique, with its own identity. And I want to propose a real partnership, not just a commercial relationship, but a partnership. I have the capital, the contacts, and business experience. You have the creative talent, the artistic vision, and a story that, even without being explicitly told, is conveyed through each piece you create. Have you ever felt that moment of absolute clarity, when the universe seems to align so perfectly that you can almost hear the pieces fitting together? For Teresa, it was as if all the difficulties of the last few months, the calluses, the tears, the doubts, suddenly made sense, revealing themselves as necessary steps on a ladder that was leading her up, not to the past. On one condition, she replied, a new firmness in her voice. No one can know who I really am. To the world, I'll just be Aurora. Yvonne nodded, understanding without the need for detailed explanations. Aurora it is then, a new dawn. That same night, while Teresa shared the news with Mrs. Zifa, the boarding house phone rang. It was Teresa, her voice lower and more urgent than usual. Mrs. Teresa, things are getting worse here. The baby was born, a boy, but Monica and Mr. Albert fight all the time, and that Ronald is running the company into the ground with crazy investments. What kind of investments? Teresa asked, feeling a contradictory mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to completely distance herself from that world, to leave the past behind. Another part, however, felt an almost compulsive curiosity about the life she had been forced to abandon. They bought land in environmental protection areas. They're bribing inspectors to get constructions approved, contracts with corrupt politicians, inflated works. Teresa paused. And there's more. Ms. Clelia is sick. Cancer, they say. The news of her ex-mother-in-law's illness hit Teresa unexpectedly. She did not feel love for the woman who had treated her with contempt and cruelty. But she also couldn't feel satisfaction with her suffering. Life had taught her that revenge and justice rarely go hand in hand. Keep me informed, Teresa, she asked, before hanging up, and take care of yourself. In the following weeks, the partnership with Yvonne began to take concrete shape. They rented a small studio in the historic center of the city. They hired 2 young apprentices to help with production, and they worked on a special collection that would mark the official launch of the Aurora brand. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity: to unite traditional artisanal techniques with contemporary design, using sustainable materials and valuing manual work. Each piece carried not only aesthetic beauty, but a story of resilience, transformation, and hope. The launch, although discreet, attracted immediate attention. Independent fashion blogs praised the originality of the pieces. The regional magazine did a story about the artisanal phenomenon that was winning over sophisticated clients. And most importantly, sales exceeded all expectations. In just 6 months, what had started as a small studio transformed into a structured company. Teresa, now officially Aurora to the world, became a respected businesswoman, although she maintained a low profile, avoiding photographs and personal interviews. We need to expand, Yvonne announced during a meeting. There is international demand for your creations. Paris, Milan, New York, everyone wants exclusivity. The mention of major fashion centers around the world made Teresa hesitate momentarily. Expansion meant visibility, and visibility increased the risk of her past coming to light. Don't worry, Yvonne reassured, noticing her apprehension. You can stay behind the scenes. I'll be the public face when necessary. While Aurora's success grew silently, Albert's life followed a different path. The risky decisions, suggested by Ronald, began to show their consequences. Projects embargoed due to environmental irregularities, heavy fines, investigations into dubious contracts. At home, the situation was no better. The marriage to Monica, which had started as a passionate affair, had turned into a series of arguments and recriminations. The arrival of their son, instead of uniting the couple, seemed to have exacerbated their differences. "You promised we would be the most powerful couple in the city," Monica accused during a particularly heated argument. "But look at us now. We're sinking into debt, while you let that sociopath ruin everything you built." Albert ran a hand through his hair, now visibly gray, despite being only 40 years old. "Things will get better. It's just a difficult phase in the market." "A phase?" Monica laughed bitterly. "Are you blind or just stupid? Ronald is destroying the company, and you're letting him." Monica's words, although harsh, carried a truth that Albert had been trying to ignore. Ronald, the childhood friend, the trusted partner, was systematically making decisions that benefited only himself, often at the expense of the company. That same night, after another argument with Monica, Albert decided to look more closely at the recent contracts. What he discovered made him cold. Forged signatures, diversion of funds to shell companies, unsustainable financial commitments. Confronted the next morning, Ronald showed no remorse. "You were too busy with your new family to pay attention to business," he replied with a cold smile. "Someone had to take the reins. This is fraud, Ronald. You could get us both sent to prison." "Us?" "No, my friend. All the signatures on those documents are yours. Some true, others, well, you understand." The implied threat was clear. If Albert reported the irregularities, he would be the main one harmed. Meanwhile, 3 years after her disappearance, Teresa was beginning a new phase in her journey. With Yvonne's financial support and the ever-growing profits of her company, she began to invest in causes that were personally significant to her. The first project was a craft school for women in vulnerable situations, victims of domestic violence, single mothers, unemployed women over 50. More than teaching techniques, the program offered a chance for a new start, for financial and emotional independence. "You're building a legacy," Mrs. Zeffa commented. Now a constant presence in Teresa's life, despite her having moved into her own apartment with a view of the sea. "I'm just giving back what I received," Teresa replied with simplicity. "When I got here, I was broken in every sense. You showed me that it was possible to rebuild, piece by piece." On a particularly significant afternoon, Teresa received an unexpected call from Teresa. "Mrs. Teresa," her voice was urgent. "Mr. Albert is on the verge of bankruptcy. Ronald disappeared from the country, taking what was left of the company's resources. And Monica is threatening to leave with the boy. The mansion is going up for auction next month." The news stirred a storm of contradictory emotions in Teresa. A part of her, small but undeniably present, felt an almost vengeful satisfaction in knowing that those who had humiliated her were now facing their own humiliations. But there was also a deeper understanding, gained through her own journey of overcoming. The true victory was not in the downfall of others, but in her own ascent. That night, after hours of reflection, Teresa made a decision that surprised even herself. She called her lawyer, a discreet professional, who handled her financial affairs and gave specific instructions. "I want to know everything about Monteiro Alves Construções. Contracts, debts, assets, legal status, everything. And I also want to participate in the auction of the mansion, but through a representative. No one can know it's me." When Yvonne questioned the decision, worried that the past could compromise everything they had built, Teresa replied with a serenity that reflected her inner transformation. "I'm not going back to the past. I'm going back to finally close a chapter. As long as that part of my story remains open, I will never be truly free. Have you ever felt that you carry an invisible weight? Something that only you perceive, but that affects every step you take. For Teresa, that weight was the unanswered questions, the unconfronted truths, the looks of pity she could never face directly. It wasn't revenge she was seeking, at least not just that. It was the chance to rewrite the ending of a story where she had been reduced to a footnote, the final confrontation. The journey back to the big city was like crossing a time portal. Every mile traveled seemed to bring with it fragments of memories, the bitter taste of humiliation, the coldness of rejection, the paralyzing fear of having nowhere to go. But now, those memories no longer had the power to destabilize her. The hotel she chose was a few blocks from the construction company's headquarters. It was luxurious enough not to raise suspicions about her financial resources, but discreet enough to ensure her privacy. She registered as Aurora Santos, the successful textile businesswoman who had come to explore investment opportunities in the region. On that first night, after settling into the room, Teresa opened her laptop and reviewed once more the detailed report that her private investigator had prepared. The information was both predictable and surprising. Albert was practically bankrupt, living in a rented apartment with his mother, Ms. Clelia, whose health was rapidly deteriorating. Monica had left 2 years ago, taking their young son and a considerable settlement that Albert could barely afford. The company, once a symbol of power and success, was now an empty shell, sustained only by its past reputation and increasingly scarce contracts. The auction of the mansion, the same one from which Teresa had been expelled with just one suitcase, was scheduled for 3 days from now. The property, once the scene of lavish parties and a symbol of social status, would be sold to pay off part of the debts to banks and investors. Closing the laptop, Teresa walked to the window. The city shone in the night, apparently unchanged. The same imposing buildings, the same busy streets, the same colorful lights of the nightclubs. But she knew that beneath that familiar surface, much had changed, and the biggest change of all was within herself. Tomorrow, she whispered to her reflection in the glass, we start turning the page. The lawyer Mendonca's office was in a commercial building in the city center. He was a respected professional, known for his discretion and efficiency, exactly what Teresa needed for the final phase of her plan. The documents are ready, Mrs. Santos, he informed her, handing her a folder with carefully organized papers. With your signature, the offer for the remaining shares will be formalized. If accepted, you will have a majority control of Monteiro Alves. And what about the mansion auction? She asked, her voice betraying only a slight tremor. Everything is prepared. Our representative will be there with authorization to bid up to the amount we discussed. I must say, however, the lawyer added with a look of slight concern, that from a strictly financial point of view, these investments are questionable. The company carries substantial debts, and the property will require extensive renovations. Teresa smiled, a smile that did not reveal her deeper motives. Sometimes, Dr. Mendonca, the value of an investment cannot be measured only in financial terms. Leaving the office, Teresa felt a sudden need to see with her own eyes what had become of her past. She drove to the neighborhood where the Monteiro mansion was, slowing down as she approached. The visual impact was immediate. The garden, once impeccable, was neglected, with weeds growing among the ornamental plants. The facade, once the object of admiration and envy, showed clear signs of neglect, peeling paint, a broken window precariously protected with boards. The imposing gate now rusted on its hinges. It was a physical reflection of the decline that Albert was experiencing in all aspects of his life. The sight should have brought Teresa satisfaction. Wasn't that what a part of her had secretly desired during those first nights of despair at Mrs. Zifa's boarding house? to see those who had discarded her taste the same abandonment, the same fall? But what she felt was something unexpected, a gentle, almost compassionate melancholy, not for the man who had betrayed her, but for the wasted potential, for the dreams they had shared, and that now lay as abandoned as that garden. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" The voice startled Teresa. A middle-aged man, probably a security guard, hired to prevent invasions of the now empty property, watched her with curiosity. "Just admiring the architecture," she replied with a polite smile. "I'm in the real estate business. I've always appreciated this style." The man nodded, not recognizing her. How could he? The Teresa he possibly knew, the shy wife of Albert Montero, had disappeared years ago, replaced by this confident and elegant woman whose eyes revealed only what she allowed. "It's going up for auction in a few days," he commented. "Too bad, it was a beautiful house." "Yes," Teresa agreed, putting on her sunglasses. It was. On the morning of the auction, the main hall of the Continental Hotel was filled with potential buyers. Curious people and, of course, those who simply wanted to witness the definitive downfall of one of the city's most traditional families. The event was more than a real estate transaction. It was a social spectacle, the final chapter of a saga of rise and fall that had fueled the conversations of the local elite for months. Teresa chose a discreet place at the back of the hall. She wore an elegant gray suit, sunglasses, and a hat that partially shaded her face. Not out of fear of being recognized, her transformation was too complete for that, but to observe without being observed. Her representative, a young lawyer assistant to Mendonça, strategically positioned himself near the stage, with clear instructions memorized and a generous bidding limit established. The murmur in the hall subsided when Albert entered, accompanied by his mother. Ms. Clelia, once an imposing figure who commanded respect and fear, now looked fragile, leaning on a cane. Her face marked not only by age, but by a bitterness that not even expensive lipstick could disguise. Something in the sight of that once powerful woman, now reduced by illness and financial disgrace, touched Teresa in an unexpected way. For a brief moment, she almost gave up on everything. The auction, buying the company, the carefully laid out plan to close the circle of her past. But then her eyes met Albert's, who was scanning the audience as if looking for a life raft in a stormy sea. He looked at her for an instant, a wrinkle of concentration forming between his eyebrows. There was a vague recognition there, as if some part of him could feel the presence of someone he had once known intimately. The moment passed, and Albert looked away, apparently dismissing the sensation as mere imagination. But for Teresa, that brief eye contact was enough to rekindle her determination. It wasn't about revenge. It never was. Not really. It was about regaining control of her own narrative. The auction began with the usual formalities. The auctioneer, a man with a powerful voice and theatrical gestures, described the property in complimentary terms that contrasted with its current condition, set the minimum bid, and opened the offers. The first bids were timid. Despite the prestige of the address, the mansion was in questionable condition and carried the stigma of a family in disgrace. Still, the value gradually increased until only two interested parties remained in the dispute: Teresa's representative and a hotel businessman who planned to convert the property into a luxury inn. When the final bid was announced, an expectant silence fell over the hall. The businessman hesitated, quickly consulted his advisors, and finally shook his head no. He would not increase his offer. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, banging the gavel with finality. "To the representative of buyer number 47. A murmur ran through the audience. Who would be the mysterious buyer? Why wasn't he present in person? Theories circulated, from foreign investors to Albert's rivals wanting to complete his humiliation. Teresa watched Albert sign the final documents, formalizing the transfer of the property that had once been his home. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the papers, as if he couldn't believe that he was actually giving up the house he had inherited from his father, the most tangible symbol of the family legacy. When the crowd began to disperse, Teresa took the opportunity to approach. It wasn't planned. On the contrary, her entire strategy was based on remaining in the shadows until the right moment. But something in that scene awakened an almost visceral need to make contact. "Mr. Montero," she said, her voice controlled despite the inner turmoil. "My condolences for the loss of your property." Albert looked at her, initially with the empty expression of someone who is too exhausted to register unknown faces. Then, again, that wrinkle of concentration, that look of near recognition. "Have we met?" he asked, his voice hoarse from someone who had drunk too much the night before, looking for courage to face this day. Teresa allowed herself a small smile. "You could say so, in another life." Before he could fully process the answer, she walked away, blending into the crowd and disappearing through a side door. Back at the hotel, Teresa received confirmation of what she already knew. The mansion now belonged to her. Legally, the property was registered in the name of one of her companies, but the control was unequivocally hers. That night, while Albert was probably drowning his sorrows in some bar, trying to understand how he had lost everything, Teresa opened a bottle of champagne in the hotel room, not to celebrate someone else's misfortune, but to mark a moment of transition. The past was being gradually recovered, not to be relived, but to be transformed. Tomorrow would be the next step, the meeting with the remaining shareholders of Montero Alves, where the identity of the new majority controller would finally be revealed. Tomorrow, the circle would begin to close definitively. While watching the bubbles dance in her glass, Teresa thought of everyone who had been part of her journey. Mrs. Zephyr, with her simple wisdom and calloused hands. Yvonne, with her business vision and unquestionable loyalty. Teresa, maintaining the fragile thread of connection with the past through the years. And she also thought of those who, without knowing it, had been catalysts for her transformation. Albert, whose betrayal inadvertently became the impulse for her to discover her own strength. Monica, whose youth and ambition had been just instruments in a larger game. Ronald, whose manipulation had destroyed what he intended to control. And Ms. Clelia, whose hostility concealed secrets that Teresa did not yet fully understand. The path that had brought her back to this city had been long and painful. But as she watched the city lights from the hotel window, the same city that had witnessed her humiliation and would now witness her triumphant return, Teresa felt a profound certainty. No matter what happened from tomorrow on, she had already won her most important battle. The battle against despair, against self-doubt, against the temptation to allow pain to define her future. The woman who had been kicked out in the rain with just one suitcase had died that night. And from the ashes of that broken version of herself, a phoenix had risen, stronger, wiser, and finally ready to confront the past not as a victim, but as the author of her own destiny. The final twist. There are moments that define an entire life. Instances crystallized in time that divide one's existence into a before and an after. For Teresa, the morning of the meeting with the shareholders of Montero Alves was to be one of those moments. The sun had barely risen when she woke up after a night of restless sleep. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she contemplated the elegant suit she had chosen for the occasion, a navy blue set, almost the same color as the dress she had worn on that fateful night of humiliation. The choice was not accidental. Symbols have power. And Teresa knew the value of closing circles. 7 years, she whispered to herself as she pinned her platinum hair into an elegant bun. 7 years since I was kicked out in the rain. The number was not just a count of time. It carried an almost mystical weight. 7 years of pain, of rebuilding, of discovery. 7 years transforming tears into determination and humiliation into strength. The boardroom on the 10th floor of the corporate building was prepared for the meeting that would change the company's destiny. A long, dark wood table dominated the room, surrounded by empty chairs that would soon be occupied by men. And a few women, who had no idea of the storm that was about to break over their heads. Teresa arrived purposely early, choosing a strategic position at the end of the table. Not at the head, where the president traditionally sat, but close enough to observe the reactions on each face when the truth was revealed. The minority shareholders were the first to arrive, middle-aged executives who talked in low voices about the latest rumors of possible buyers for the company in crisis. None of them paid special attention to the elegant woman who discreetly consulted her tablet. When Albert finally entered the room, he seemed to have aged a decade since the auction. Deep, dark circles marked his face, his shoulders hunched under the weight of worries that seemed to have no end. His eyes quickly scanned those present, stopping for an instant on Teresa before moving on. That same flash of near recognition she had noticed before. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began with a voice that tried, without success, to project confidence. "We are here to discuss the future of Montero Alves at a critical moment in our history. And have you ever witnessed someone trying to keep up appearances when everything is already falling apart? There is something profoundly human and painfully moving in that effort to preserve dignity when everything else has already been lost. As you know," Albert continued, "we recently lost my family residence due to the financial difficulties we face. But I am confident that, with some restructurings and new investments, we can." The door opened, interrupting his speech. The lawyer Mendonça entered, nodding discreetly to Teresa before taking his place at the table. "Forgive my delay," he said, arranging papers on the table. "I believe we can proceed with the true purpose of this meeting, the formal presentation for the new majority shareholder of Montero Alves Construções." A heavy silence fell over the room. Albert visibly paled, his eyes now fixed on Teresa, as if the pieces were finally starting to fit together. "I have the honor of presenting," Mendonça continued, "Mrs. Aurora Santos, or rather," he paused, looking at Teresa, who nodded slightly, authorizing him to proceed. "Mrs. Teresa Montero." The name dropped into the room like a bomb. There were muffled gasps, incredulous looks, and a single sharp sound. Albert dropping the pen he was holding, the small metallic object clinking in the absolute silence that followed. Teresa stood up calmly, feeling a strange inner peace. This moment, so often rehearsed in her mind, had finally arrived. "Yes, it's me," she confirmed, her voice clear and firm. "For those who don't recognize me, and I understand perfectly why. I was one day the wife of Albert Montero and the daughter-in-law of Ms. Clelia. I was kicked out of my home on a rainy night with only one suitcase after being publicly humiliated." Her eyes met Albert's, who seemed unable to look away, hypnotized by this transformed version of the woman he had abandoned. "But I'm not here to talk about the past," she continued. "I'm here as the owner of 6% of the shares of this company, with full powers to determine its future." The reactions varied from shock to indignation, but Teresa remained unshakable as Mendonça distributed documents proving the legal acquisition of the shares. "As a first measure," she announced, "I order the immediate removal of Albert Montero from the presidency." One of the oldest shareholders rose, red with indignation. "This is absurd. A personal revenge disguised as business." Teresa smiled, a smile that contained no joy, only determination. On the contrary, sir, it's a rescue of a company that was once a symbol of integrity before misguided decisions led it to the brink of bankruptcy. She opened a folder, revealing documents marked in red. Decisions like these, fraudulent contracts, diversion of funds, tax evasion, all with the signature of Albert or his fugitive partner, Ronald Alves. The silence that followed was deafening. There was no possible defense against such compelling evidence. My second order, Teresa continued, is that an internal investigation be opened into all the irregularities committed in the last 5 years, with full transparency for the competent authorities. You're going to destroy me, Albert murmured, finally finding his voice. Is that what you want? Complete revenge? Something in the vulnerability of that question touched Teresa more deeply than she expected. It wasn't the powerful businessman speaking. It was the broken man, finally confronting the consequences of his choices. No, Albert, she replied, her voice softening for the first time. If I wanted to destroy you, I would just have to hand these documents directly to the public prosecutor's office. What I want is justice, and justice doesn't always mean punishment. It means, above all, truth. The meeting was formally closed after the presentation of the restructuring plan that Teresa had developed with the help of Yvonne and specialized consultants. An audacious plan that completely reoriented the company's focus towards sustainable construction, using innovative technologies and materials. Ironically, many of these were based on the projects Teresa had designed years ago that were ridiculed by Albert and Ronald as silly dreams of someone who doesn't understand anything. When everyone had left, leaving only her and Albert in the now silent room, Teresa felt the weight of the years condensing into that moment. Why? He asked finally. Why come back? Why not just move on with your life? Forget all this? Teresa watched him for a long moment. The man in front of her seemed like a ghost of the person who had once loved her, not just because of his haggard appearance, but because of something deeper that was broken inside him. Because some stories need a proper ending, she replied. Because for years I lived as a ghost, with another identity, another name, hiding who I really am. I needed to reclaim my story to be able to finally turn the page. Albert absorbed this slowly, as if he understood. Then, with an unexpected movement, he knelt before her. Forgive me, he pleaded, tears finally escaping his eyes. Forgive me for everything. I need to tell you the truth. And there, in the boardroom where so many business decisions had been made, Albert revealed the secret that would forever change Teresa's understanding of her own life. She was not just the rejected ex-wife, but the unacknowledged daughter of the family patriarch, the result of an extramarital affair that Ms. Clelia knew about and tolerated only to keep up appearances and maintain control. You're my half-sister, he concluded, his voice broken with emotion. Ronald discovered old documents. He threatened to expose everything if I didn't separate from you. I gave in to blackmail, to cowardice. I chose the family's reputation over our marriage. Teresa's world seemed to slow down, as if every particle of air around her had suddenly become too dense to allow movement. Albert's words echoed in her mind, completely reorganizing her understanding not only of the past, but of her own identity. Half-sister, she repeated, her voice just a whisper. So Ms. Clelia knew the whole time. She thought it was better to keep you close as a daughter-in-law than as a stepdaughter. She feared you would discover the truth and demand part of the inheritance. A bitter laugh escaped Teresa's lips, not out of humor, but from disbelief at the cruel irony of fate. Her whole life had been built on a lie, an elaborate farce, where even her marriage had been part of a strategy to protect family secrets. For days, Teresa isolated herself in her hotel room, trying to process the revelation that transformed not only her past, but her understanding of herself. She was not just the betrayed wife, she was the denied daughter, the hidden heir, the never-acknowledged sister. When she finally emerged from her isolation, Teresa had made a decision that surprised even herself. She called a press conference and, without revealing the secret of her origins, announced a complete restructuring of the company. Montero Alves will be maintained, she declared to the cameras, but with a new mission and vision. We will transform a company that lost its way in questionable practices into a model of ethical and sustainable business. As for Albert, Teresa offered what no one expected, a chance at redemption. Not in the presidency, not in a position of power, but in a role where he could contribute with his knowledge while learning a new way of doing business. I discovered that revenge does not build, she confessed to Yvonne in a late-night call. It only perpetuates the cycle of pain. What I want to leave as a legacy is not the destruction of those who hurt me, but the construction of something better from the ruins. The auctioned mansion, a symbol of so many painful memories, was transformed into a support center for women in vulnerable situations. A space where those who, like her one day, had nowhere to go, could find not only shelter, but opportunities for a new beginning. On a particularly significant afternoon, when the center was about to be inaugurated, Teresa received an unexpected visit. Ms. Clelia, visibly frail from her illness, but with still penetrating eyes that carried the weight of decades of secrets. "Why are you doing all this?" the woman asked, leaning heavily on her cane. "After everything we did to you?" Teresa looked at the woman who, unbeknownst to her, was in fact her stepmother. She felt no hatred, no resentment, but a strange compassion. After all, Ms. Clelia had also been a victim of a system that valued appearances over truths, reputation over authenticity. "Because I discovered," Teresa replied, "that our greatest revenge against those who tried to destroy us is not to let them define who we are or what we become." That night, alone in her new apartment with a view of the sea, an element that had become essential in her life since the days at Mrs. Zepha's boarding house, Teresa reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her there. From the shy and insecure wife to the powerful businesswoman, from the publicly humiliated woman to the respected philanthropist, from the victim to the protagonist of her own story. The truth about her origins, although painful, had been the final piece of the puzzle she needed to truly move forward. Not as Teresa, the rejected wife. Not as Aurora, the mysterious artist. But as herself, in all her contradictions and complexities, scars and achievements. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Yvonne, calling to confirm her arrival the next day, to help with the final preparations for the center's inauguration. "How are you feeling?" asked her friend and partner, concern evident in her voice. Teresa smiled, watching the moon's reflection on the calm waters of the ocean. "At peace," she replied sincerely. Finally at peace. Because in the 7 years that transformed a humiliated woman into a powerful businesswoman, Teresa learned that true revenge is not about destroying, but about rebuilding. The revealed secret not only changed what she thought of the past, but opened unexpected paths to a future where justice and compassion could walk together. Teresa finally understood that she did not return just for revenge, but for something much bigger. She had discovered the truth about her origins and rewritten her own story. The rejected girl was now a powerful woman, capable of turning her pain into strength to help other women overcome their own stories of abandonment and rejection. Looking at the horizon where sky and sea merged in an indistinguishable line, Teresa felt a profound certainty. A person's value is not in what others do to them, but in what they choose to do with what they have lived. And she had chosen to transform her pain not into bitterness, but into purpose, not into destruction, but into rebuilding.